Welcome you to the Fall Sczepaniak Lecture. We're very pleased to have Gerald Adelmann here today as our speaker, and we have a few comments that we'd like to make before Jerry starts his talk. First, I'd like to invite Dr. Eileen McMahon to the podium. She's the chair of the History Department.
Thank you and good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Fall James and Mary Claire Sczepaniak Lecture Series. And before we get started, I'd like to give you a save the date. Our spring dinner lecture for the Sczepaniak series is going to be Thursday, March 22nd. We are observing the 100th anniversary of the conclusion of World War I. And so we have as our guest speaker, Dr. Ross Kennedy from Illinois State University. He has a book on the will to believe, Woodrow Wilson and World War I, America's Strategy for Peace and Security. It won the Scotts Bills Prize in Peace History. So please make note of that. It is a dinner lecture. The lecture is free, but anybody can also come to the dinner beforehand. We'd like to see you all there. This morning, it is my pleasure to welcome our president, Dr. David Livingston, who would like to say a few words to you.
Thank you, Eileen. It is a pleasure to be here today and to be here for me for my second lecture in this series. We are very fortunate and very grateful to James and Mary Claire Sczepaniak for endowing this lecture series and making it possible for us as a community to celebrate the history of the region and especially the history of Lockport and Romeoville, Joliet, and the IM Canal. This lecture series was established through a generous gift from Jim Sczepaniak in his will, and it has impacted our university in many ways. It provides our students, our faculty, alumni, friends, members of the local community an opportunity to examine what is going on in the history, and I think it's easy for many of us as we drive up and down Route 53 to forget that the canal that's just on the other side was one of the most impactful events that happened that changed really the structure of the whole Midwest. We are fortunate tonight, and this afternoon, I won't do the full introduction, but I have been very fortunate to get to know Gerald Adelmann over the last year and a half, who is president and CEO of Open Lands. And so not only is he a long-term resident of Lockport and an amazing historian in his own right, but also somebody who impacts our region in terms of conservation in an incredibly significant way. We are also grateful to Jerry and Jerry's parents, who set up an endowment for the Howard and Lois Adelmann collection here at Lewis University, which allows us to continue to keep a collection that helps us understand the history of the IM Canal and all that goes with it. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Kremen, but I am just really grateful that Jerry's here and grateful for the legacy that the Sczepaniaks have allowed us to keep up and in front of our students and our community. So, Dr. Kremen.
So I have just a brief story to tell. About 20 years ago, I met somebody who grew up as a young man in a nearby community. Interested in history. People would come and give him old items from the community. Showed intelligence in this Christian household, went to the nearby Catholic high school. His studies took him around the world all the way to Paris. He came back to his hometown of Lockport, Illinois, just over the bridge, involved in preserving historic places. Old Central Square, the old school at the center of town. He gets involved with his father and others, lots of others. It always takes a lot of work to preserve a place like that. And then we could list other places that he's been involved with, especially the Gaylord Building Historic Site. But more than that, he became interested in historic preservation and the environment. And he was able to conceptualize with others this idea of the I&M Canal National Heritage Corridor. So we have somebody who showed great promise, like many of you students in this room show great promise for the future, and you have this ability to transform the world with a little bit of vision. The other thing that you know, it's Jerry Adelmann I'm talking about, he's able to connect people, connect all sorts of different people, from senators and congressmen to business leaders to people who are interested in just taking a walk in a nearby park or forest preserve or someplace else. I would encourage you, we have brochures right outside the door for open lands. Their big event is right around the corner, November 9th. It's a luncheon downtown. I encourage you to consider a membership. And also, don't forget in the spring, the really important event, the second part of the Sczepaniak series this year, March 22nd. More information through Lewis University. So I want to thank you for coming, and want to introduce and bring to the podium Gerald W. Adelmann.
Thank you very much, Dennis. You know, of you who are here, I see so many familiar faces and people who have played important roles in some of the things that I'll be talking about, from Brother James and Ann Hintz and Rosemary. And I better stop because I'll get in trouble. Identifying wonderful people who care deeply about this region, these places. And, you know, I said the title placemaking. You say, what's that? You know, I mean, and all of us, I think, in our lives have places. It might be a building, it might be a park, it might be a square, it could be a landscape that are special, that hold deep meaning in our lives. You know, they won't survive unless conscious decisions are made about their future. And in this age of globalization, climate change, rapid growth, there are all sorts of challenges. And what I'd like to do is kind of share with you some of my experiences here in Lockport and along the I&M Canal, and also with volunteer work that I've been doing in Southeast Asia since the early 90s. I'm on the board of an organization at Columbia University in New York called the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange. And it's a long story, I won't go into all the details here, but I got involved early on. They were interested in a project, the I&M Canal National Heritage Corridor, for a province in China, Yunnan, which has the most cultural diversity and the most biological diversity, but was at the brink of rapid growth and change. And so, again, how to protect and enhance those unique assets and allow for growth. And because the Heritage Corridor was an effort of public-private partnership with a living, working, you know, kind of landscape, not a pristine park in a classic national park sense, and where the goals incorporated economic development as well as conservation and historic preservation, it was something that was very attractive to the center that was beginning to work in Yunnan. So two of the important kind of conclusions or findings that I've had through my work is that, one, you need a good plan. You've got to have a vision. You have to see how all the pieces fit into a bigger whole. And secondly, you've got to have community engagement in developing that and implementing it over time. I mean, those are just two critical ingredients for success. And without it, it's going to be a piecemeal approach. You might be successful in protecting a particular site or an isolated building, but a sense of place that it will definitely only survive future generations if people understand the interconnections and if there's a lot of buy-in from the stakeholders, the people who live there, who work there, the businesses, the elected officials, and so forth. Almost 40 years ago, I was a kid, moved back to this area, and Lockport was celebrating its sesquicentennial of founding. This was 1980. First permanent white settlement in Lockport was in 1830. And very quickly we put together a little book called Lockport: A Collective Heritage that showcased some of the history and illustrated with photos important buildings in town and spoke about the natural resources and the canal and so forth. And in the introduction, I wrote, with the revitalization of Old Central Square, Old Central School and the public square, an important direction has been set in this community. That was the sesquicentennial project. It was abandoned for 11 years, was threatened with demolition. The value of a distinguished landmark was recognized, and an innovative and practical solution found, which allows it to continue to play a vital role in the life of the town. The Lockport Township Park District is implementing a plan to develop our section of the Illinois-Michigan Canal as a linear park, and to acquire additional lands adjacent to the canal, which would include historic quarries and a natural prairie. The Lockport Area Development Commission is establishing a revolving fund to assist the revitalization of downtown business district, a program recommended by the Historic American Engineering Record last summer. Lockport is showing many signs of a new appreciation for the past and its important role in the shaping of our future. I ended with, look at your surroundings with a careful eye and try to determine which resources you would like to share with future generations. Will our rich heritage survive projected physical and demographic growth, or will we obliterate our unique legacy in the process of change? This is a challenge and a decision for the entire community. Let your voice be heard. And many voices were heard. And I will show you some slides later, and we'll kind of revisit where Lockport is today and where it was then. And again, the power of a good plan, but most importantly, of citizens voicing their concern, their values, and getting involved. Now, as a country, over 80% of our people now live in metropolitan areas. Globally, over 50%. And estimates are that by 2050, 70% of the but you'll think of northeastern Illinois, the greater Chicago region. And this massive growth can be very destructive, especially to our ecosystems. And of course, open lands, we were formed in 1963 as a regional land conservation group. And in Illinois, the challenges are especially great because we have so many units of local government in northeastern Illinois. Almost 300 municipalities in the 7 counties, countless other units of government, and land use decisions are being made every day in kind of a piecemeal way. So a not-for-profit like Open Lands can really focus on the big picture, convene people representing different jurisdictions within this complicated, geopolitical landscape. Because rivers, streams, biodiversity, habitat, they don't respect political boundaries. So an area like ours has special challenges, not just at the local level, but also trying to begin to understand, as a region, how all of these things fit into a greater whole. The nature of development has been pretty much, you've got a clean slate. You go in, you bulldoze whatever's there, you put in a shopping center, a new housing development, and often there are no remnants, no touchstones to what was there previously. And so I think that's, again, one of the great challenges of growth is how to incorporate, elements from the past in meaningful ways so that they function and play vital roles in our economy and our culture. But future generations will be able to say, oh, well, this was the historic downtown, and here's an old farmhouse that now is a community center, or whatever it may be, but things that give us insight into what this place was like previously and how it's evolved and changed over time. We need to develop some very innovative approaches to infrastructure, clearly. 75% of our greenhouse gases are emitted in cities and metropolitan areas. So we need to focus on transit, on alternative energy, on nature-based solutions as well, in terms of making sure we have a vital urban forest that is cleaning our air and cooling us in the summer, absorbing stormwater during rains. Last week, I think, was a good example here. I heard that one of the communities nearby had, I think, 8 or 10 inches of rain, literally, in a few-hour period. Look what's going on globally in terms of climate change. Painfully, we see it, in Florida and Texas, in the Virgin Islands, in Puerto Rico. These extreme occurrences are only getting greater. So we have to be very resilient. So it's not just preserving things, but it's also understanding change, some things that are totally out of our control. And then, as we look around the world, most development is kind of anonymous. I mean, you could be dropped down from outer space and you could go to a shopping center somewhere in Southeast Asia or in Hawaii or in China or whatever, and maybe the vegetation is different and possibly some of the style of the architecture, but it's pretty anonymous. It doesn't really indicate in any way what's special about this place, its unique culture and history and heritage. So we really have to try to strengthen this spirit of place. I think that's really important. And embrace the unique cultural traditions and those assets in the landscape, the cultural and natural assets that are there, and figure out ways to incorporate them into the future of these communities. So what I'd like to do is share a few slides with you and kind of talk about some of these issues. Here we have Fort Dearborn, 1831. Chicago is the least likely place for a great city to develop that one could imagine, a swamp, But it's at this point where the Great Lakes meet the inland waterways. It's a subcontinental divide. And Native Americans recognize this route, coming up the Illinois and the Des Plaines over to the Portage area, Chicago River to Lake Michigan. Ultimately then, you could travel from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Atlantic seaboard, but for this portage area. So they suggested a canal be built that far back. And in the 18th century, certain decisions were made, Native American treaties and so forth, that set aside land for the fort at the mouth of this river, Chicago, and along the corridor that became the canal. And Chicago was the fastest growing city in the history of the world. It went from 300 people, in 1833 or whatever, to, by 1910, over 2 million. Never had such explosive growth ever happened. And it didn't leave a lot in terms of what the landscape held initially. Here's a map that shows kind of the natural resources of the area before permanent white settlement. So you see the pale green, that's prairie, the darker is forest, the deep blue are wetlands. You look at this huge wetland, I'm not sure if I can point with this or not, let's see. Well, anyway, but right here, for instance, the Grand Kankakee Marsh, one of the largest wetlands in the central part of the nation. So 70 years later, wetlands gone, prairie's gone, most of the forest is gone. What you see, the kind of brownish gray there, that's farmland, agriculture. And you can see, though, that development was very concentrated along the transportation corridors. So it was this kind of hub and spoke kind of development, the center city along the lake, and then suburbs and satellite cities, following the rail lines. So by 1950, growth had continued, but still kind of followed those patterns. And this is right after World War II. The GI Bill had been enacted, which provided funding for home ownership, but it had to be new homes. You couldn't buy an old home. And the Highway Act, which was seen initially as a defense legislation to have good highways across the country that we could move equipment and arms and tanks and so forth, should we be in another war. It was really funded largely, or supported largely by home builders and road builders, but all of that really then changed dramatically the morphology, if you want, of the Chicago region, and of so many cities around the country. So here's what happened by 2000. Kind of undifferentiated development, what we would call sprawl. But you also look at what's here, all this green. That's there because there was a plan. There were conscious decisions made that these lands should be set aside. And Dennis, I know, has lectured on the Burnham Plan of 1909. Chicago business leaders got together and they tapped their colleague, Daniel Burnham, the great architect, and said, we need a plan. You know, that what's happening here is chaotic, and we need a framework that will help us think about the future of the area. How can we compete internationally and have a high quality of life? And you know, we know some of the problems that Chicago experienced because it was built on a swamp. The river emptied into the lake. It was polluting our drinking source. Tens of thousands of people would die from cholera and other epidemics. You know, flooding was rampant and so forth. The lakefront was taken over largely by railroads and industry. And they said, no, we need to create a world-class city. And they looked to Rome, they looked to Paris, they looked to Vienna and cities around the world, and came up with the Burnham Plan. And here it showcases the green piece of it, which really was the element that ultimately was implemented over many years. And the Cook County Forest Preserve District was established in 1916 based on this plan. It was the first in the nation of a large-scale metropolitan park system, if you want. And we're still working to fill in some of those gaps. Again, this speaks to the power of that blueprint of a plan, something that was adopted in an official way, but that over time was always referenced and provided, you know, kind of the inspiration and the vision that subsequent generations would then adopt. So the kind of development that we had was very disruptive to the ecology of our region. And this is true of cities, you know, rapidly developing cities all over the world. There's a coalition of agencies and organizations called Chicago Wilderness. It covers parts of the 3-state area. Basically, that's the geography of my organization, also Open Lands. And they developed this green infrastructure vision, looking at both public and private lands and trying to identify critical watersheds and linkages, you know, between public areas and protected lands that should be protected through a variety of tools, including private property that would be protected through easements in a voluntary way, or conservation design developments that would incorporate wetlands and natural features, trails, and other amenities. And this has been adopted by our regional planning organization, CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Some communities have used this as a framework for their thinking about their own local plans. And again, the power of a plan that can be pretty significant, I think. Open lands, as I mentioned, we were formed in 1963 by the Welfare Council of Metropolitan Chicago, so kind of an unusual conservation group, because very much from the beginning concerned about the quality of life of this region and social justice and social equity issues. The feeling is that nature is vital to all people and they should have access to it close to home. Some of our founders were very involved in fresh air camps, getting inner city youth, you know, out into the countryside in the summers and so forth. Others were kind of your classic conservationists. Our founding chairman, Jeff Short, was involved in international conservation. A great friend of Prince Philip, involved in Africa and saving habitat for big cats and whatever. But he said, nobody's looking at things here. We have these vestiges of the original prairie and wonderful oak groves and wetlands and natural areas. There was no voice for open space. And so Open Lands was created. It was originally called Open Lands Project, a project of the Welfare Council. So over the years, Open Lands got its work done through partnerships, working with local groups, with local communities, a relatively small organization given the geography and so forth. And over time, opportunities emerged, and one of them focused on our waterways. We did a great deal since the 1960s to improve water quality, and very little to improve access. And so we developed the first water trails plan. It was a partnership with our regional planning organization and also a group that's focused on canoeing and kayaking in the area. And we get people together in rooms like this, and they say, well, we only have about 5 miles of this particular waterway. What could we do? Or we only have a mile here. And by piecing together all these parts and understanding the kind of relationships between units of government, forest preserve districts, park districts, and so forth, a plan emerged, almost 500 miles of our waterways for canoeing and kayaking. And it was there already. All we needed to do was develop the launches, basically, the infrastructure for it, good signage as well. And many of these trails now have active volunteers, citizen groups that are going out, cleaning up the waterways, monitoring when there are log jams and other kinds of challenges, working with the units of government that manage those areas to develop good interpretive signage and ways to engage people in understanding this region, not just experiencing it from a recreational point of view. Well, this plan was done 15 or 20 years ago, and it's taken that long to implement it. It's piece by piece, and now it's pretty much in place. If you go to our website, openlands.org, there's a whole section that will direct you to the individual water trails within our area, and it's really impressive. But again, this underscores the importance of having a vision, having a plan, a comprehensive approach, and making sure that there's buy-in from those who live and work and lead these communities as elected officials. The Chicago River, of course, is an important part of that. I think you've been reading a lot about the River Walk and new plans for the North Branch and so forth. Open Lands was the first group to really focus on the river as a forgotten waterfront. We launched Friends of the Chicago River in 1979, and for 10 years it was housed with us as a special project. Now has a life of its own and is doing great work and so forth. But you realize you got to take the long view. These things don't happen overnight. And when you're basically retrofitting a landscape, one that has been abused and neglected and hasn't been understood in a comprehensive way, the challenges are very great indeed. So the I&M Canal, as Dave said, this was a catalytic internal improvement that both positioned Chicago as this great city on the prairie and all the towns along it, but really provided a gateway to the west. This was seen as one of the most important internal improvements for a couple centuries, really. Father Marquette and Louis Joliet, the first Europeans of record to come through this area in 1673, recognized that we were at this continental divide. They came through in the rainy season, and they felt that if you could dig a canal just a few miles long through the Chicago Portage, connecting the Chicago River at Chicago with the Des Plaines, that you could have continuous water travel possible from the Atlantic seaboard to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, if they came through in August or September, that Prairie River would have been drier, and the rapids and so forth, they would have realized that they needed a much longer canal. I apologize, bad allergy day, not my best, and so I might get coughing here, but it'll pass. During the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the New Deal, during the Depression, the canal was adopted as one of the projects for Illinois. And young men developed the towpath as a hiking and biking trail. Some state parks were established, forest preserves. And then World War II started, the CCC was abolished. The canal was under the ownership of the Department of Transportation, not the Department of Conservation at the time. So all of those improvements were not maintained. And then fast forward, late 50s, the state of Illinois is looking for easy access for a new north-south expressway. Today, the Stevenson was going to be called the I&M Canal Expressway. And they used the last 12 miles or so of the canal into the city of Chicago, which was abandoned, as the right-of-way. And then the state said, we need money, kind of like today. We own these canal lands, some of which have been leased to industry and to communities. Why don't we sell it off? Citizens were outraged. Many of them, especially the men in the communities who had worked as boys, said, this is our heritage. And others, people like John Lamb, Professor Lamb, who for many years headed the history department here and launched the canal collection and so forth, he and others in Lockport, but up and down this 100-mile corridor from LaSalle, Peru, all the way into Chicago, said, no, this is too important. And they turned to Open Lands, this new organization. So we started this Operation Green Strip, organized local officials and grassroots groups and so forth, and that culminated in 1974 with the creation of the I&M Canal Trail, which started at Joliet and went down southwest to LaSalle, Peru. They excluded Joliet, Lockport, Lamont, Willow Springs, and so forth because the canal was fragmented. And they said we couldn't have a continuous linear park. But some of the greatest support actually came from that area. So they kept coming back to Open Lands, help us save this prairie, what about our little section of the canal, and so forth. I moved back here and with others then started conceiving of what became the I&M Canal National Heritage Corridor, a landscape scale approach. Here's a map of the corridor. And this was very much a grassroots effort, going up and down that region, meeting with historical societies and conservation groups and local officials, chambers of commerce, Rotary. Now this was when this region was very much the Rust Belt. Joliet in 1980 had the highest unemployment in the nation, 25%. So to talk about a national park, people thought you were crazy. But we were talking about quality of life, about sense of place, about the future of this region. How can this area compete as you think about the future? I was born in Lockport. My family has lived there for generations. And as a boy, we had a vibrant downtown, all sorts of little shops and so forth. And the community had a very clear sense of place, continuity, generations of people living there. Texaco was the major employer, over 600 people, other large businesses. It all started changing. These dramatic changes in our economy, especially in our industrial sector, with factories laying off huge numbers of people or shutting down totally. Shopping centers and sort of sprawl development beginning to happen. The older downtowns being abandoned. It was kind of a bleak environment. But one of the things we found talking to industry up and down this corridor, and of course industry continued, it's a major transportation corridor, it continues to be one of the most important in the upper Midwest, is that we're having a hard time attracting high-level personnel here. They'd rather live out in the Rockies or on the East Coast, or this isn't perceived as a desirable place to live. And so the Heritage Corridor effort really melded a number of concerns and opportunities. Again, looking at ways to create a much more attractive place, a more competitive place, and also one that would address the real issues and challenges of the day, how to attract investment. So in 1984, the corridor was established officially by Congress. President Reagan, August 24th, 1984, came to Chicago, the Hilton Hotel, and signed the legislation. And we started a national movement. There are now 49 heritage areas around the country and dozens others that are being planned and considered. Congress has not moved forward with any of those new designations. But again, this idea of a partnership park, public-private, not one big decision like a Yellowstone, you put a boundary around it and everything inside is owned by the government and everything outside isn't. No, these are living, working landscapes with disinvestment and dereliction, as well as extraordinary assets, archaeological sites, wonderful natural areas, beautiful historic buildings, interesting downtowns, but that had fallen on hard times. So in Lockport, we brought in 1979, this is just when the thinking was beginning about this approach, something called the Historic American Engineering Record. It's a division of the Department of Interior. And the community had to raise $40,000. That was a lot of money then. The chamber got behind it, and local citizens of all kinds, businesses and whatnot, to do a plan to rethink the downtown and the canal area. The canal then was filled with garbage and weeds growing alongside of it and so forth. Here's the Gaylord building back at that time. And they singled out 3 buildings as pilots: the Gaylord building, the Norton building, and the Adelmann block, which my great-grandfather had built. We did not own it at the time. All 3 of them were in pretty bad shape, but very significant architecturally and historically. Here's the Gaylord building a few years ago, wonderfully restored. Pam Owens is with us, who is the site manager. It's a National Trust property. And that really was a catalyst. Gaylord Donnelly, whose mother was born in Lockport, a prominent business and civic leader from Chicago, purchased the building with his family, restored it, not as a tribute to him, but as a catalyst to get the corridor created. This was held out as kind of a carrot. If you pass this legislation, these are the kinds of investments that people are willing to make, but they want the certainty of a plan, of a framework, and not just some isolated projects scattered about. And Hintz became the director and worked so closely on it. So many other people here, I'm going to get in trouble by mentioning names. But anyway, Gaylord building. I'm sure many of you have been to the Public Landing Restaurant. It's a public-private partnership in terms of the uses. The Norton building, the largest limestone building in the state of Illinois. When it was built, there's some question about the exact year. The canal opened in 1848. It was built shortly thereafter. We know by 1850 it was there. 2/3 of it, the blank wall there, was a grain elevator, because the canal opened and suddenly all the farmland in central Illinois, some of the richest in the world, is producing all this grain, and it's coming into Chicago on the canal before it would come on wagons, in gunny sacks. And the scale of it was so great, they said, we've got to manage this differently. So the Board of Trade was established in 1848 in Chicago to deal with all this grain coming in. And again, the volume of it said, we can't keep Farmer Jones' grain, in his gunny sacks, and Farmer Norton's and his, and so forth. We're going to commingle them. We will grade them, in whatever system you use, AAA or whatever. And these oats are, this caliber. And so someone bringing their grain in would be given a certificate. They'd be commingled in a grain elevator. This is one of the first grain elevators in the world. Buffalo claims to have the first. Maybe we have the second. But that's what this 2/3 was, right on the canal. There was hydropower that moved the grain through these bins and so forth. The other side of the building was a general store on the ground floor, offices, a residence, and then the top, those little windows, was a dormitory, actually, for the mule tenders that would go with the mules and the canal boats. Today, Tom Elves and Bob Brzezinski, owners of Tallgrass Restaurant, they purchased the building, lovingly restored it, and it's a mixed-use development, including the Illinois State Museum, which we see here. The heart and soul of our communities are in downtowns, no question. And Lockport's blessed with a very special downtown. It was the first National Register district listed on the National Register in Illinois, 1974. John Lamb, again, played a very important role in putting that application together and making it happen. And we're fortunate to have groups like Main Street that recognize the value and know that you have to work at making these function. It's not just the buildings, but what's going on in them, and what about parking, and how about joint promotions, and there are lots of things that go into placemaking. Special activities. They have to be vibrant, living places that play meaningful roles in today's life. We can't have museums everywhere. Yes, museums are wonderful, but that's the exception. We have to think about adaptive reuse and continuous use of structures. So the canal trail that I mentioned, I mean, 60 miles was established in 1974, but this northern area, was fragmented and so forth. Today we have over 80 miles of trail along the I&M. We're continuing to add pieces further north. It's part of a 500-mile trail system throughout northeastern Illinois. But again, these are things that are conscious decisions that take a long time to implement, for which there must be significant buy-in. Elected officials change, obviously, all the time. And so you have to re-educate them, re-engage them. The voters, the people who elect them, are the voices. I could go there as a head of a not-for-profit. That doesn't carry a lot of weight, other than we talk about our members and so forth. But when the people who elect them to office start calling and sending letters and emails and so forth about a particular issue, they'll listen. And it's because of that buy-in over time that we now have this extraordinary trail system. So I went away to college, left Lockport, went to Washington, ended up living in Europe for a few years, teaching and studying, coming back to Washington. That experience in Europe, though, gave me a very different perspective on things. There I saw where buildings are reused. I mean, for millennia in some cases, certainly hundreds of years. Why do we tear everything down? It's like, I saw Lockport with different eyes, experiencing how other places have treated their heritage, how they have incorporated their built environment and their natural areas into contemporary society and economy. And I was pretty depressed about Lockport. Everything seemed to be negative, loss of industry, loss of traditional businesses, buildings being boarded up, people not feeling good about where they lived, and yet say, but this is an amazing community and so much still survives of its past, strategically located in terms of the future, and whatever. So it gave me a whole new perspective, and actually the Heritage Corridor concept of a broad landscape scale effort really was inspired by the national parks in Great Britain. A national park there is not like our national park. It's like the Lake District, a huge landscape area, largely controlled by private citizens, but where the government, with local communities and private parties, tried to establish a framework to preserve that unique sense of place, that character, that allows for continual growth and change. In France, they have something called les parcs régionaux, these regional parks. That was also kind of inspirational in many ways. Not thinking, again, of a park as something that's set aside and isolated, but actually could be something that is much broader and really incorporates where people live and work today. So I got involved in China, and that was an amazing experience. I went there once with the center thinking that I'd go once in my life. I've been there about 35 or 40 times, and working primarily in this one province, Yunnan, on a national park, on some historic preservation, urban planning projects, and so forth. If you're familiar with Asian cities, very few of them have a wonderful sense of place, unfortunately. They've bulldozed so much. New development has been extremely insensitive. Often just a few isolated buildings are singled out. They become a museum or a hotel or whatever, but the life of that city no longer exists. So more recently, I've gotten involved in Myanmar and Burma. I worked on this national park, Galibanshan, that borders Burma and China. And through that and various other contacts, I always wanted to visit Burma, but because of the military junta and Aung San Suu Kyi being in house arrest, saying, don't come, your tourism dollars, will support the junta. And when she was released and said it's okay, I immediately went, And I was just going as a tourist. I would try to piggyback my trips to Yunnan and visit other parts of the world. I do it on vacation time, and so why not enjoy it and experience, as many places as one could. But I got pulled into things, and I met a fellow named Thant Minh Chu. His grandfather was U Thant, the Secretary General of the UN in the 60s and 70s, a remarkable person, who became the head of the UN, and shortly thereafter, the junta took place, the military coup. He was sort of persona non grata in his own country. His only child, a surviving child, came to New York to live with him, his daughter, and his grandson, Fatima Yu, was born in New York. So he's actually an American citizen, went to Harvard, went to Cambridge in England, got his PhD. He's a very talented historian and writer, taught there, married a Swedish woman who was involved with the UN. Both of them went back to Southeast Asia, and he kind of rediscovered Rangoon, Yangon, the former capital, which was the garden city of Southeast Asia. Burma, before World War II, was the wealthiest country in Southeast Asia. It's the poorest today. The city itself is much like Havana. It's had more development than Havana. There was a period where some really ugly buildings were built and quite a few things were torn down, but so much remains. The military general who was in charge went to his fortune teller and said, "You must build a new capital." And so they, like Brasilia, they went out in the middle of nowhere and built Naypyidaw, billions of dollars, and abandoned then the old capital. So Thant realized that there was a unique opportunity here to learn from both best practices and mistakes in other parts of Asia and the world, and how to keep this remarkable city a very special place, in spite of all the challenges. They have no zoning, no planning, nothing. So he founded the Yangon Heritage Trust, a not-for-profit, and I've been a senior advisor with him, helping to identify resources, bringing technical help, and so forth. So I have a little video that I'm going to show you, which they just developed. It's like 3 minutes or so, it's short here. But I think it gives a good flavor for their work and what they're trying to do in terms of placemaking, if you want, at a large scale. This is a city of over 5 million that's scheduled to probably double in size over the next 25 years.
Heritage Trust ကအန်တီတို့အတွက်အားကိုးရတဲ့ဖွဲ့စည်းမှုဖြစ်ပါတယ်။အန်တီတို့လိုအပ်တဲ့အကြံပြုချက်တွေကိုသူတို့ဆီကနေပြီးတော့တောင်းခံနေရှိပါတယ်။သူတို့နဲ့လည်းပူးပေါင်းညှိနှိုင်းဆောင်ရွက်ရရှိပါတယ်။
And we run a business here, and nothing that YHD suggested would deteriorate our business. It would only make it better. YHD ကျွန်တော်ဆိုင်ဝင်သွားမှလည်း blue flag လေးပေါ့အခုတက်လာပါတယ်။တက်လာပဲဒီလူတိုင်းစိတ်ဝင်စားရင်တော့စာဖတ်ကြတယ်။သူတို့ဖတ်တဲ့ခါကျတော့ဒီစာအုပ်ကသူ့ရဲ့သမိုင်းကြောင်းနဲ့တန်ဖိုးကိုပြီးသွားကြတာပေါ့။အဲအများကြီးကျိုးရှိပါတယ်။အားလုံးနဲ့လူငယ်များစွာဒီမျိုးနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့သိချာကားကနာမသိဘူး။ဒီလိုပွဲစည်းတစ်ခုရှိနေတဲ့အကြောင်းမျိုးနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့လူငယ်တွေအနေနဲ့ပို့ပြီးတော့သိလာတယ်။အဲဒီမျိုးကိုပို့ပြီးတော့ခင်ကျွဲလာတယ်စိတ်ဝင်စားလာတယ်ပေါ့။
ဒီစာအုပ်ကိုအန်တီရဲ့ generation မှာအန်တီထိန်းသိမ်းခဲ့တယ်ပေါ့အန်တီရဲ့နောက်လာမယ့်အန်တီသားသမီးရဲ့ generation မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ထိန်းသိမ်းဖို့အန်တီကတော့ပြောခဲ့မှာပဲ
Yangon is the last remaining city that can maintain the culture, the skyline, the landscape, the way that we won't be able to reverse in many cities that we have in Southeast Asia already.
ဒီကျေးမှုအမွေလေးဆိုတာတော့ဒါတွေကကိုယ့်ရဲ့ identity ပေါ့နော်ကိုယ်မှာဒါရုပ်နဲ့ကိုယ်နဲ့ဆက်သွယ်ပြီးသားရှိတယ်ပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီဟာတွေကိုဒီကျမတို့အဖွဲ့အစည်းကဒါတွေကိုပြန်ပြီးတော့ဖြစ်စားလာအောင်ပေါ့နော်လူတိုင်းပုံသိလာအောင်လုပ်ပြရတာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
So obviously, a city like Yangon has different dynamics and issues than a little town like Lockport, but there's so many parallels, I think. Community engagement. One of the things that Thant and the organization Yangon Heritage Trust is trying to do is not just keep these buildings and restore them, but to try to keep the life of the communities that are there still involved, still living in these buildings. By American standards, we would say these aren't very prosperous people. They're middle-class people, though, who have, many of them, who have small businesses, shops, and so forth. And so there's a social justice kind of piece to this as well that often is not part of urban renewal or historic preservation. Gentrification is a huge challenge. And so that is a layer here that they're trying to incorporate. Initially, the focus was just on the historic core. How do we save these marvelous buildings? And some people say, why are you saving colonial buildings? This represents oppression, but this is the birthplace of the modern nation. Aung San Suu Kyi's father, who was the father of independent Burma, was assassinated in one of those buildings that you saw, a big courtyard and so forth, with his colleagues in 47 rather, and 48 independence came. This is where the first parliament was held, the first flag was raised. Generations of people have lived in these buildings who are Burmese, It was also an extraordinarily diverse city. The Christian Brothers had a very famous school, but there were Muslims and Buddhists and just about every Christian and other denomination one could imagine. It was called the Garden City of Southeast Asia, beautiful parks, and they had a horrible hurricane cyclone in 2008, Nargis, which did so much damage. Some of those buildings that you saw that are derelict, they were never repaired after World War II, even. So no zoning, no planning, and the focus was, let's save these buildings. But then you said, wait a minute though, developers are coming in, they want to put in high-rises. The infrastructure is terrible. This is at sea level. When it rains, the streets are rivers, basically. They don't have transit. There are all sorts of huge issues. And so actually it was through Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Phil Enquist, who's just a visionary planner, who's just retiring this week actually, but head of global planning for Skidmore, based in Chicago, and he and his team went over and said, no, you've got to figure out, where do you put the growth? What about sewers and water and transit? And so they now have broadened their focus to really be a comprehensive planning effort, integrated planning effort that identifies and preserves or recommends the preservation of those great historic buildings, revitalization of the parks, but also bringing in a lot of new green infrastructure and other kinds of elements for a successful global city. Today, countries do not compete with one another economically. It's one global city versus another. It's London, versus Beijing, versus Hong Kong, versus New York, San Francisco, whatever. They recognize that. So in fact, January I'll be going over, we have a big powwow with the leading officials. A plan has been developed and we're hoping that they're going to adopt it. So far, all development has been put on halt. You probably have also followed the horrible tragedies, the human rights tragedies in Myanmar with the Rohingya people. It's a very complicated situation right now. And as a country is trying to become democratic, it's not easy. And yet these things are terribly important as well. There's so much corruption there that easily what you just saw, all those historic buildings could be bulldozed. And so I have great admiration for the kind of leadership recognizing that in spite of all the economic and social and political challenges, that they also have to take the long view and start establishing the plan, again, a framework for growth and development, in this big city. So, I think my time is almost up here. I apologize for my allergies, kind of not as clear ahead as usual. But I think the message is that we must connect ourselves to very special places in our lives. It's so important. And these are things that have meaning forever for you. And if you care about your community, whatever it may be, thinking about your children, your grandchildren, what are those things that you feel future generations should also benefit from? And you've got to let your voice be heard. You've got to get engaged. You have to go to the local zoning board, when there's a hearing about a controversial plan, or the city's doing a new master plan. get involved. There are lots of interesting tools that have been developed, some that we used in the Heritage Corridor, versus visual preference surveys where you get lots of citizens into the high school auditorium and you show slides of places in the community and they rank them from maybe a -10 to a +10, and then you pull that all together and they say, these are the places we really like, these are the things we don't like. Then you look at the local plan and the zoning and so forth and say, but there's a misfit here. What you would like to see and what you would like to preserve in your community and the kind of development that you'd like to have happen isn't what you're going to get, Because when you start talking zoning, and it eyes glaze over, this technical kind of language about setbacks and heights and densities and all this sort of thing. But pictures people can relate to. We've also done things where we send people out with their Polaroid, the throwaway Polaroid cameras, the disposable, and just photograph those places you love. We did this along the whole entire Heritage Corridor. And a lot of that has helped inform some of the advocacy and the preservation efforts. But there are lots of interesting tools that are available. Certainly today with social media, it's amazing, in terms of really getting larger numbers of people, and especially young people. I mean, you are the future, the students here at Lewis. And if you care at all about history and about, places that have meaning in your life, if you love nature, you've got to get involved. It's that simple. And there are various ways to do it. And Lewis has been a leader, and I have so much admiration for Brother James and his leadership after so many years. Talk about a sense of place. Look at this campus. My God, it's gorgeous. And it wasn't quite that beautiful 30 years ago. Again, conscious decisions, piecemeal but consistent following through on great plans, finding the resources, building the support. I know that your new president shares these grand visions. I've had conversations with him about how to integrate Lewis in even more meaningful ways into this broader region. Trail linkages, landscaping opportunities, trying to figure out how creatively to link downtown Lockport again, maybe with Lewis, obviously the relationship with Romeoville, which is critical, but as part of the bigger region as well. Brother James was on the board of Chicago Metropolis 2020, which was really something that developed in response to the anniversary of the Burnham Plan in many ways. It's kind of like we had this great plan, we followed, what are we doing today? What is our vision? So business leaders came together with government and civic and social leaders. Brother James was on that board. So Lewis has played a very important role locally, regionally, and beyond. And I think the kind of values, the LaSallian values and the values that are reflected in your landscape are the kinds of things that we all need to embrace and pursue. So it's been a great honor to share some of this with you, to have these associations with Lewis and your faculty and over a period of many years. Dennis is fantastic in terms of his leadership with the History Center and finding opportunities for meaningful projects that enrich not just Lewis and the student experience, but also give back to communities in so many ways. So, thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions if we have a moment here. But again, it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Jerry, I want to thank you so much. I'm looking at some of the students and they're getting nervous because they have to move along. But what I want to do is make you available over here maybe for a little bit to take any questions. I have a few quick thank yous. Lisa Heiser, meeting, events, and conferences. All of this takes a lot of effort. University Advancement, especially Bob Kononik, who's worked so closely with us. The Office of the President, the History Department, especially our Secretary Linda Snell. And again, we have two events coming up. Open Lands Luncheon. Get involved, become civically involved. And also March 22nd, we have the World War II, the World War I lecture that will be here in the evening on March 22nd. Again, thank you so much, Jerry. And one last statement, we do have a light lunch set up over here. If I could have the community visitors go to the table first, if the students would hold back just for a little bit. and then we can move over to the tables, and then the students can move over once our guests on campus have been served. Thank you so much, and again, Jerry Adelmann, let's hear it from you.